Hello, today is Monday, August 31st, 2020. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Yesterday, August 30th, there was a massive half-day network outage that interrupted service across the U.S. The latest news reports indicate that there was an astonishing 3.5% drop in global internet traffic during the downtime incident. The list of well-known enterprises affected by this outage was shockingly long and almost certainly resulted in a significant impact on their businesses across a wide variety of industries. In the new cloud-based world that enterprises use to run their businesses, this outage clearly revealed that there is a daisy chain of multiple internet service providers, cloud providers, carrier-neutral facilities, and network operators. If one or more of these entities manages to shut down some or all of the public internet, really bad things can happen, like we saw on Sunday. What we're going to discuss on today's podcast is what we know so far about what caused this massive outage. But more importantly, we're going to look at some things that large enterprises can do. Well, let me rephrase that. What they absolutely should do to make sure they protect themselves to the extent possible from future incidents. I'm fortunate to be joined by Theresa Knutson, a fellow director at TC2, David Lee, TC2's technical director, and Andrew Brown, the chairman of TC2 and the managing partner of LB3. Okay, thank you all for joining me today. Theresa, since you suffered from this outage in an up-close and personal way, why don't you tell us what happened?
Well, hey, Joe. And yeah, it was kind of a funny story, but I was at Starbucks yesterday morning early, and I was in the drive-thru and I ordered. And as I was driving up to the window to pay, I was going to use my Starbucks app and it wouldn't connect. So I kind of panicked a little bit because I didn't bring my wallet and I was struggling to find change to pay for my drink because my app didn't work. So, crisis averted, got my coffee. But when I got home, I was curious as to what happened because typically that's a very reliable platform. So I researched it and found out that there was something bigger going on. So it turns out that Starbucks was seriously affected by the CenturyLink outage, along with a whole litany of brand name companies like Hulu, Amazon, Twitter. So it got me curious, and so I started tracking the outage throughout the day and looking for updates. The initial reports seemed to indicate that the outage was caused by CenturyLink and some activity that they were undertaking in their network to update the rules in their firewalls. They apparently pushed out an update which interfered with the border gateway protocol announcements that are propagated across their network. Without the correct BGP announcements, internet routers can't effectively transmit and receive traffic, which basically led to a blackout on communications. So data that was transiting the CenturyLink network, which remember is a huge part of the internet backbone and is a large part of the legacy level 3 network assets, that traffic wasn't going anywhere.
Well, it's obvious that the discussion of the cause of this is going to get technical pretty fast. So let me bring in the technical expert now. David, what can you add to what Theresa described there at a high level to help us all understand what happened and specifically how something like this could happen to a major internet service provider like CenturyLink?
Yeah, Joe, they're probably wondering the same thing, actually. And early reports that came out yesterday, late last night, actually, that CenturyLink sent out the faulty BGP announcements using something called FlowSpec, which is really an extension of the BGP protocol used by some providers, but not all, to distribute firewall rules very quickly across their network. And say in response to a distributed denial of service attack or some other emergency. But when you distribute an update across the entire network quickly, it better be a sound and confident update. Otherwise, you've just propagated a mess of a problem, which is what appears to have happened here, causing a dramatic instability in the BGP routes. If you were a CenturyLink customer or trying to communicate with one, you weren't going to get through until the problem was corrected.
Yeah, and what's interesting here, to give you an idea of the severity of the problem, was that CenturyLink actually remediated this by apparently advising all other Tier 1 ISPs to deep peer and ignore any traffic coming from CenturyLink, which results in a full connectivity loss to its customer. So it was a pretty extraordinary step for them to take in order to remediate the problem.
Yeah, it's frankly amazing they would have to do that. Okay, Andrew, let me turn to the lawyer amongst us. Have you, Andrew, got any calls or inquiries about what CenturyLink customers can do here?
No, not yet. But usually when there's a network outage, the first call that people make isn't to their lawyer. Better to get the problem fixed first, then start looking for remedies from the responsible parties and checking out your contracts. So as you'd expect in cases like this, there was a bit of finger pointing, although it does look like CenturyLink has assumed responsibility for causing the problem. So here's the deal. Network updates, those are obviously done all the time. They have to be, and customers want them to be to ensure the networks are up to speed and fully modern. But many updates present the possibility of interfering with the network stability and customer access to the services they buy. And the major internet service providers should be able to do this without taking the entire network down. CenturyLink, unfortunately, doesn't have the best track record on this. It's caused a few incidents like this in the past couple of years. And two things stand out really about this most recent event, though. The first was the scope of the outage, which was pretty big. And second was the length of time, something like 7 hours that it took to get things back up to normal.
That's a pretty severe one.
Yeah, it was. And so it will definitely be worth the company's efforts to find out what remedies they have, including possible SLA payments. And you also have to look at what exclusions to such remedies you might have agreed to, not thinking something like this would ever happen. And let me say that if you get one thing out of this podcast from me, it's this. Going forward, this is really an important area for companies to focus on because cloud-based architectures are obviously growing explosively, as are the number of parties involved in moving network traffic now, which really increases the likelihood that something like this can happen.
So that's a good point. And we should discuss it a bit more because it really does get to the core of how network sourcing is evolving, right, Theresa? I mean, our clients, they move towards a predominantly cloud-based strategy for their applications and infrastructure, which means, we've been doing a lot of advising to have them focus on thinking about the information that they need to solicit from their suppliers and the requirements they need to impose on their suppliers.
Yeah, absolutely. And customers, they need to know where in their network provider's network that their cloud connections are located, and then ensure that both parties and paths are completely redundant, including access and your POP diversity. A lot of companies also assist on complete supplier redundancy, which is obviously more complicated from both a technical and sourcing perspective, but it decreases the likelihood of a single provider's failure from taking down your entire network, and it mitigates the effect if something bad does incur.
And adding to what she just mentioned, as enterprises are migrating from MPLS to an internet-first wide area network strategy with typically an SD-WAN as the overlay, you need to review your internet providers and understand their public and private peering points. And that's just so much more critical given this outage we had yesterday. In addition, enterprises need to be proactive in terms of monitoring the public cloud service environment, by having the right tools at their disposal to understand the root cause of the issue, have an action plan to resolve that issue. There are tools now that can monitor and view into the sometimes opaque public internet hosting providers, software as a service providers, and the like. Examples of tools like this are Thousand Eyes, which was recently acquired by Cisco, and Nectar, which specializes in real-time monitoring and diagnosis of voice and multimedia services, whether it be UCaaS or contact as a service type services. It's also worth pointing out to note that TechCaliber and LB3 brought this topic up at a couple of different conferences where we talked about these kinds of tools and capabilities, because if you look at what Amazon and Microsoft have for native tools, they're really focused on their specific services and what's inside their data center, but not on an enterprise's end-to-end view of their traffic. And that's what an enterprise really needs.
Okay. Thanks, guys. This has really been a good discussion on what's really a rapidly developing story. We'll take another look at this, and as the facts evolve, and if there's something useful to share, we will share it. In the meantime, if you have questions about the CenturyLink outage, or you want additional information about issues with your network services, I encourage you to check out our websites at LB3 and TC2, or just feel free to get in touch with one of the LB3 or TC2 professionals that you know or that you regularly work with. Now, we'd also be happy to talk about this outage or any of your ICT lifecycle needs. And then finally, you can subscribe to the Staying Connected podcast, and please do follow us on LinkedIn.